Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the Lamoille Flood Resiliency and Hazard Mitigation Working Group meeting on Thursday, November 6th, 2025. My name is Tori Howig. I'm a regional planner with Lamoille County Planning Commission. On our agenda tonight, we're planning on providing an overview of the EDA resiliency planning project, including the Lamoille and Northern Vermont Long-Term Resiliency and Recovery Plan. And we're joined tonight by SLR consulting staff to provide an update on the hydraulic flood model of the Lamoille River, key tributaries, and some site-specific alternative analyses. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen to provide a brief overview of the project and then pass it off to SLR for the flood model. Okay. So thank you again for joining tonight's meeting. I'll provide a brief overview on the EDA flood resiliency project scope and timeline for the project. Plug the update to the Lamoille River flood model that SLR will be speaking to, and preview the long-term recovery and resiliency plan that's being developed under the scope of this project. So just to orient folks in the scope of work and timeline for the EDA project. For context, the first edition of the Lamoille River hydraulic flood model was developed in 2019 with SLR, formerly Malone and McBroom. In 2023, there were the federally declared disaster flood events that sparked some federal funding available to plan for disaster recovery efforts. In June 2024, the Northern Vermont Economic Development District received a planning grant through the EDA, which is the Economic Development Administration. In January 2025, SLR was procured to update the Lamoille River flood model to include additional towns along the Lamoille River main stem and some key tributaries that feed into the Lamoille River. Over the summer and fall of 2025, there was some data collected for the flood model update, and we began drafting the long-term recovery and resiliency plan. The plan will be available for public comment starting November 21st through December 5th, and then the project will be completed and wrap up on the 9th of December, which is rapidly approaching. Through the whole scope of the project, there's been some ongoing community engagement and technical assistance provided to communities heavily impacted by the July 2023 floods. LCPC staff and other regional planning commissions and regional development corporations have been providing ongoing assistance and engagement with communities. The LCPC also hosted a regional plan survey in our region to collect some data and information to inform the update to a regional plan, but also the long-term recovery and resiliency plan. And in September, there was a business flood preparedness workshop hosted by regional development corporations. That meeting was recorded. They walked through a emergency planning workbook that's linked on our LCPC website in case you missed the meeting and would like to view that and follow along. Also ongoing was the update to the flood model and then drafting the plan. Just a brief highlight of some of the data that was collected and results from the Lamoille County Regional Plan Survey. One question that was asked of folks in our region was how should the county respond to a changing climate and recent increase in flood events? Some popular answers were conservation and restoration of floodplains, upgrading bridges and culverts, and relocating development out of flood-prone areas. There was also another category in which responses included supporting upland wetlands, engaging in watershed level planning, considering downstream impacts of projects, and employing beavers and helping with flood mitigation. Another question that was included in our survey was asking folks to indicate how much they agreed with the following statements. The first was whether the county should elevate and flood-proof existing buildings to protect them from future flooding. Some folks agreed, some disagreed, and folks didn't feel strongly either way too much. The other statement is that Lamoille County should relocate vulnerable buildings and people out of the floodplain to protect them from future flooding. For the most part, people either strongly agreed or agreed with that statement, but there were some folks that also disagreed. So just shows that there's not a clear answer and not a clear solution to this problem. It'll really need to be a place-based discussion and place-based solutions identified depending on where the community is and what they feel is needed. The flood model update that SLR will speak to momentarily was to extend the 2019 flood model upstream to include Hardwick down through Fairfax and Georgia on the way to Lake Champlain. The light blue river was what was extended or included in the original flood model, and then the light blue outlined in red is what is being included in the update under this project. So the Lamoille River and Hardwick is being included, as well as some key tributaries, Cooper Brook, the Guion River, Seymour, and the last one.
Mill and Stone.
Village Stone, yeah.
But just wanted to provide that visual and preview what SLR will be speaking to shortly. And another big key deliverable under the project is the long-term recovery and resiliency plan. The overall outline of the plan is that it'll begin with a background on the Northern Vermont region and community cores and centers, as well as some data and discussion on the flooding and disaster impacts from the July 2023 floods. Part 2 of the plan will cover planning for recovery and resilience, including a brief discussion of the Lamoille River flood model updates and alternatives, and flood impacts, risks, and challenges in 4 key areas in our communities. Public and private infrastructure, downtowns, village centers, and economic drivers, municipal and social services, and natural resources. It'll conclude with some goals and next steps that was identified in some of the ongoing community engagement and discussions with flood impacted communities, and also an appendix with resources and links to things like the business emergency planning workbook, websites, and contact information for different folks and agencies. Some of the key takeaways and recommendations that have come up through ongoing community engagement and data collection are to invest in resilience strategies that would mitigate impacts to communities and infrastructure, relocating essential services out of the floodplain, elevating and flood-proofing municipal buildings where relocation is not feasible, upsizing culverts and bridges, and developing and expanding infrastructure to transition development to safer areas. Using the Lamoille River flood model to identify and assess alternatives for projects has come up as a key recommendation, and one of the outcomes of this project will also be posting the flood model online on a website that communities can use to interact with the flood model and assess projects and look at it live locally. We'll continue to meet with communities for the month of November into December. The draft recovery and resiliency plan is going to be available on the LCPC website for public comment starting November 21st, and the project wraps up on December 9th. I welcome all comments, questions, and feedback to the plan. My contact information is on the screen. Can also throw it in the chat. I guess I'll pause for any questions folks might have about the project before passing over to SLR to speak to the flood model and alternatives analysis.
I have a question.
Okay.
Is Hardwick in the long-term resiliency and recovery plan, or is it just?
Yep. It will cover, it'll speak to the region generally, but there's a focus on highly impacted communities along the Lamoille River main stem from the July 2023 floods. So Hardwick, Wolcott, Johnson, Cambridge, and Jeffersonville.
And we can share a draft too, if you want to.
Yeah.
Look and add Hardwick's comments specific.
Don't see anything online, so I'll stop sharing my screen and pass the mic over to SLR. You should also be able to share screen.
Sure. So we can start out with some introductions, I guess, just so you know who we are. So there are 4 of us joining you tonight. We are all water resources engineers at SLR, and have been working on the Lamoille River in various communities since right after Tropical Storm Irene. So I'm Jessica Luisos.
Josephine Allen.
Doug Osborne.
And
Hey, I'm Roy Ship online.
Roy's joining us as well. So we're going to collectively walk through the Lamoille River modeling and give an overview of the alternatives analysis and some project examples that we have pulled out. So, you know, as you see here, really walking through kind of the existing conditions and the model setup, what that looks like. And then I think at that point, we would take some questions about kind of the existing model before we jump into the alternatives analysis and kind of what that's going to look like for various communities with examples. I think you're starting out.
Yeah. So this is a map that we just saw that outlines the extent of the Lamoille model. Like it was mentioned before, the blue is what was existing in place, and the red is where we have added on the Lamoille and also a few key tributaries. That is to say, we also updated the model throughout what was existing there to begin with. So this whole model has been worked on this past few months, and really exciting new results with that. So in terms of building the model, we first used the 2023 LiDAR, which got us a sense of what the floodplains look like and what the elevations are, if there's buildings, if there's a big farm, kind of it gives us a sense of what that landscape looks like. And this is a cross-section view, so as if you were like standing in the river. You have one bank on one side with the hills kind of sloping up on one side, and this dotted line kind of encapsulates where that surface of the water is. And then in order to get below the surface of the water, we used FEMA flood insurance studies, survey information, and some field work where we were able to determine what that channel geometry was in the river itself. Going further, we added some bridges using a lot of past bridge plans and survey information. We were able to add like buildings to see where those buildings were, so the water couldn't flow through them. And then adding in land cover kinds of gives us a sense of what type of landscapes in the way of the water. Like if it's moving through trees, the water might move a little bit slower. If it's going over pavement, it's going to move a little bit quicker. So this is kind of the base information that sets up the geometry of the model. And then we need to add all of the water, and hydrology is kind of the piece of big that tells us how much water is going to move through each of these cross sections. So Doug can tell us a little bit more about the hydrology bit.
Yeah, so slide here is just gonna give a little bit of background. This project is focusing on what we call the hydraulics, which is how the water is moving through the river, through the different channels, the tributaries. But obviously a big piece of that is how much water, which is really defined by the hydrology of the watershed. And in this case, we are taking existing flows, actually some new exciting flows that FEMA developed as part of their update to their maps. And these are flows that are kind of just in draft form and we just got access to this summer. So it was really exciting to be able to update the flow information for the whole model. And so just a little background in terms of, the hydrology, how much water is getting into the river, what are the things that are affecting that? Obviously the rainfall amount, the length of time that the rain is falling, and then of course the intensity are three big pieces. But then the characteristics of the watershed itself, the topography, the elevation, the slopes, as well as the land cover. As Joe mentioned, how quickly is it running off the landscape? And then something that, I think we talked a lot about with our July 2023 storms was, the conditions going into a flood. So the soil moisture, if we've had a lot of rain recently, then we're going to see a lot more of that rain running off than you would if the ground was dry and able to absorb more of the moisture. And so a couple different ways that you can calculate the flows that are getting into the river. The first is a gauge analysis. USGS has gauges all over the country continuously measuring stream flow. This is, you can see on the right is a screenshot of the USGS gauge in Johnson for the 2023 flood. And this is the ideal. We know exactly how much flow is in the river at any given time. We know the peak flood at this point in time. But we only have two continuous long-term gauges in the Lamoille watershed. So, we need to be able to estimate how much flow there is in all the places that aren't gauged, which is the vast majority of the watershed. And so one way of doing that is rainfall runoff modeling. And this is what was recently completed for the FEMA study. They created a large hydrology model of the whole watershed, looking at how the water is running off of each part of the watershed and getting into the channel, in the tributaries and then the main stem. And so we have these updated flows from their work that we're able to incorporate into this modeling. And then the final thing just to mention is regional regressions. If anyone's ever used stream stats from USGS, you can click on a point and click on a point in a stream and it will tell you estimated flows based on watershed size, and then kind of characteristics of the watershed that have been put into a formula based on similar streams in Vermont. So with that said, we just wanted to take a step back and talk about what is the 100-year flood. We hear a lot about this flood was a 100-year flood, this was the 500-year flood. And I think that can certainly be confusing for a lot of people. And we're gonna use that terminology in our, discussion here. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page and, understand kind of that colloquial term that we're using. So the 100-year flood is a flood that has a 1% chance of being equal or exceeded in any 1 year. So over on the right, you see this table for, the 2-year flood that has a 50% chance of being exceeded, 10-year, 10%, and so on. So when we say, oh, we've had 2 50-year floods in the past 5 years, or, 200-year floods in the past 15 years, and, logically, this doesn't make sense. But, one of the reasons, along with others, is that, in any given year, there's a 1% chance of that flood happening. And so you can have it 2 years in a row, you cannot have it for 100 years. It's really a risk and probability estimate there. So as that bullet says, a 100-year flood has an average recurrence interval of 100 years, but it could happen in back-to-back years. It could not happen for under 50 years. But really, it was chosen by the National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program in the 60s. And it was chosen because, as that last bullet says, it was thought to be a fair balance between protecting the public and overly stringent regulation. So that's, kind of gives you a feel for what their thinking was. We're going to regulate these floodplains that we're defining by having a 1% chance of flooding in any given year, and that's our acceptable level of risk. So as time goes on, we're seeing larger floods. Maybe what they defined as the 1% flood wasn't actually, it was, something smaller. And, at the same time, our risk tolerance can also change, as we move forward, and depending what infrastructure we're talking about, if it's critical, buildings or access routes, or of course, people's homes, then that level of risk might not be acceptable truly. And so, I was just gonna run through some of, what that looks like at these 2 gauges. So again, we have 2 USGS gauges that have a long-term record of both about 100 years and, are still present. One is in East Georgia, all the way to the downstream end of the watershed, and then one is Johnson, sort of in the middle of the watershed. And again, here's that screenshot of, what the 2023 flood looked like at the gauge in Johnson. So, when we have these great gauge information data sets, we're able to do this analysis and really understand, for this past period of record, what kind of floods were we seeing and what is the risk level, of these different floods and these settings in the floodplains and around the river. So on the left here, you're seeing for the Johnson gauge, the peak flow for each year from the 1920s when the gauge was installed up until 2024, where you see the large flows in the last few years that are showing up in the end of the timeline. And then on the right is for the East Georgia gauge, which started a little bit later in the 30s. So one key data point is that Johnson has thank you. No, we can go to that. So, here I'm just calling out what some of those years are corresponding to those data points. So the Johnson gauge has a data point for the 1927 flood, which by all accounts is the largest flood in recorded history or memory in Vermont. But the East Georgia gauge does not, started in the 30s, so it doesn't have that really large flood from 1927. But what you can see is, some of our largest floods here in the last really 30 years called out, on the Johnson gauge, from 95, 2011, 23, 24, we've really seen, aside from 1927, really all of our largest floods in the last 30 years. And that's similar in the East Georgia gauge. 2023 was the largest, and then 2011, 2024 were the second and third largest. But it's actually something that is sort of interesting to think about is that if you look at those 2011 data points, it was a large flood in Johnson, but maybe not reaching the levels of 95 in 2023, whereas it was really the second largest flood that's been experienced in Georgia. And that's just something to keep in mind about really the spatial variability of these floods. And so when we're looking at our alternatives and modeling different floods, we're kind of modeling the same flood for the whole watershed. But that, as we know, that's not always the case. Different parts of the watershed are experiencing larger floods or smaller floods than are shown on these gauges. And then the last piece on these graphs is I just wanted to throw on the those recurrence intervals of the floods that we're looking at. So starting with the 2-year all the way up to the 500-year on the right side of each graph, you can see how those data points correspond to the calculated flood flows in each of these two locations. So in Johnson, the 2023 flood is a little bit above the 100-year as calculated by the recent FEMA analysis. And if for the Johnson gauge or the Georgia gauge, it was a little higher, closer to, it's not on there, but about maybe the 200-year recurrence interval flood. But both kind of in between that 100 and 500-year flood level. And again, something that just really jumps out when you look at this is, again, if you look at the 25-year flood line in Johnson, we've seen according to this 3 25-year floods in the last 30 years. But there were none experienced between 1927 and 1985. So that's just, again, that risk that's defined by these flood flows is what's driving that.
No, I guess I would just say that those are the new flows, which are higher than the previous FEMA flows from the study that had been done decades ago. So right before this data came out, you might have said the 100-year flow is 18,000, or it was a lower number. So I just wanted to make sure folks knew that this was the new estimates for those recurrence intervals, which are higher.
Sorry, I'm not understanding. What is can you give an example of what it was before and what it is now based on what's on the screen?
Yeah, do you remember? So for Johnson.
So for Johnson, it's not labeled here, but the FEMA report from 1987 defined the 100-year flow as about 19,000 CFS. So about the 50-year line here. And the new 100-year flow is about 23,000 CFS.
So just to make sure I understand that, so the old maps, the ones that are the 1970s, 1980s maps, what they showed as a 100-year storm in terms of CFS, which is the amount of water, is now, based on the new calculations, the equivalent of a 50 storm, more or less. So the recurrence is increased significantly of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Does that make sense, Beth?
Yes, I have a whole bunch of conflicting thoughts running through my head that I won't share. But the calculation is based on events that have occurred causing the duration to increase. I mean, the thing that's running through my head is all of the communities that we're talking about were impacted by the 2023. I won't say the political aspect of what's running through my head. The thing that's running through my head in terms of impact, though, is that regardless of what that 100-year flood calculation comes up with, the actual impact to communities is still very impactful if we hit a certain I don't know if it's discharge level or river surface level or overflow level. I don't know what the actual term, the correct term is, but we still have that at the prior 100-year event because the current recurrence is more frequent. It just feels like it doesn't talk to the impact to communities is what I guess I'm saying, because we're increasing the threshold for 100-year events, but that doesn't change the impact that those flood events have on communities when they hit certain water levels. Anyway, it's probably like a given, but I feel like it's worth saying out loud. Because I'm thinking about it in terms of what we can do and should do to make impactful change to protect our communities.
I think one of the things that I think about is, it's recognizing that we're having larger storms so that we can, better communicate with folks who might have previously thought they were outside of the flood zone to say, actually, there's more water for some of these storms than you might have expected in the past. And so I think it can help us like plan better by understanding that, we are getting the bigger storms.
And I guess I'd also say, you know, whatever we call these, these flows, when we're doing our model, we're looking at these ranges of flows, right? So, so there are areas that are starting to be impacted by what we're calling the 50-year flood, then that's, something that we're looking at, okay, like do our alternatives change when they're impacted, or, how much water they're experiencing during that flow, right? I think we can get really focused because of FEMA's focus on the 100-year, but something that we're thinking about is, you look at the 10-year, flood even, you can see that that's happening every 5 or so years, in recent times. So if, there are places that are being hit continuously during that 10-year flood, then it's, certainly going to be something of interest when we're looking at alternatives of, are we having impact at those lower flows also? So just to summarize, the map on the right here is again showing our watershed, and each blue endpoint is a place where the flow is being input or changing along the tributaries and the main stem. So just wanted to give an idea of, I was just showing these two gauges where we have good data, but using the new flows from FEMA that cover most of our study area, we did do a little analysis of some of the tributaries that we're looking at they don't include. So we had to develop some trend lines to get flows for those. But we're really looking at how the flow is changing all over the watershed as part of this analysis.
Yeah, so that's the input. And I think a lot of us are very interested in like, what's it actually going to be telling us? So we have a couple examples to just give a general overview before we get into specific results. So it's going to tell us the water surface elevation. So how high is the water getting? That's shown here in cross section where you can see for the different flows, we know what those elevations are. It shows us the extent of flooding. So looking at floodplain mapping, how far out the flood is going to go. We sometimes call that inundation. And then it gives us the actual flow characteristics. So specifically, like what is the velocity in different locations? So here we have the blue is a lower velocity and the other color is a higher velocity. And this is mapped on top of the topography, which is our contours. Can also show depth mapping, so how deep is the flooding happening in the river, which is kind of a deeper blue where it's deeper, and a lighter blue where the water is less deep, which could really help understand kind of those patterns through where the flood is going in any particular location. And then we have other views where we can actually look at the channel and the water in profile and understand how things like dams or bridges or other constrictions might be, holding up water or changing depth along the length of the river. So this is as though you slice the river right down the middle and are looking at it from the side. So with the ground being kind of the brown and the water depth being the blue there. You can look, kind of specifically right in the model. In this case, you can see where there's some backwatering upstream of the dam, with the blue line being our water surface, and down at the bottom, the black line being our channel bed. Looking at how water flows through. In this case, there's an example of a bridge and a dam. And what that's then looking even further at like what that overtopping of a structure might look like, or the scour. I thought this was really interesting just to look at the full length of the model in profile, really seeing how different it is through the watershed. This isn't looking at the tributaries, just the main stem here, but the very, very steep areas, up in Hardwick, and how it might be really different as the river kind of the slope drops off and is a much lower slope down through the lower sections of the river.
Sorry, what does channel distance mean?
Channel distance is literally like how far up you are. So in this case, 0 is at the entrance of Lake Arrowhead in Georgia. And so it's distance upstream from that particular location. And here they are, it's in miles. So there's about 350 miles of river shown.
Okay.
Next we wanted to talk about how accurate the model is, and like we've done this whole exercise of figuring out what the hydrology is and figuring out what the channel geometries look like, but can we actually trust this model that we've built to replicate the river patterns and future conditions of different floods? So one way we'd like to check the model and make sure it's on track is by using pictures and videos of flooding as just a visual check to see if the model is accurately representing the conditions that have been observed in the past. Another way we do that is looking at high water marks. USGS has a ton of high water marks in the Lamoille watershed from the 2023 July flood and the December 2023 flood. And so using what the water surface that we have estimated to be the July 2023 flood, we can compare that with those high water marks. And so this is in Jeffersonville. And you can see there's 4 points right here, and they're all kind of within 1 foot of those high water marks. So the positive numbers indicate that the high water marks were a little bit above what we predicted in the model, and these negative numbers kind of say that the model or the high water marks are a little bit below what the model has shown us. But in general, I'd say these 2D models or 1D models that we're developing are within about 1 foot of accuracy. And this is a really good example of where that model's kind of checking that box and is doing a really good job. I think in other places, maybe it might not look perfect or super exact to what of the observed conditions, but there's a lot of different factors that go on in a flood that can change how how the flows might be different or show up different. So I think in general, this model does a really good job of accurately representing the flood patterns and flow conditions that we have seen in the past, and also can help us predict what those flow conditions can look like in the future, and how alternatives can be impacted, and understanding what the change of flows or water levels or velocities can be seen as you test different alternatives. I think it does a really good job of showing that comparison. Here is just another profile view of those high water marks. This is the same two bridges in Jeffersonville. So you can see where the high water marks are a little bit below where we've seen the water surface elevation, and also maybe a little bit above, but in general, it's pretty close. So I'd say that's pretty good. Next, we have a little bit of a model demo. I don't know if you can see that. So now we kind of wanted to just to play around with the model, just as a way of showing that it's not just a static image result, that you can actually zoom to different things, see different results, show different information. So this is just the aerial imagery. This is Johnson. And what we use to show the water or the terrain, to show the water, we can turn on the terrain. So this is like a DEM where you can see the different landscapes and the contours on the landscape. And then when we built the model, we put in some cross sections. So at each of these cross sections, this is where the model is like doing all the different calculations. And this is where we input all of the bridge information and channel geometry information. So at every single one of these cross sections, there's a ton of information that tells us what the flood waters are doing. You can also see they have outlines of those buildings, and that lets us see where the water might not be able to flow. And you can also maybe turn on a bridge. You can see where the bridges are. And then looking at some just results, can turn, this is the 2-year flood. And you can kind of see that the water is mainly sticking in the main channel of the Lamoille here and the main channel of the Guion. It's spilling out a little bit into these like lower floodplains around the confluence area. But mainly sticking into the main like valley bottom area where that river is mainly located. Yeah. So then as we move through the different flood recurrence intervals, this is the 10-year flood. So a little bit more water, it's like filling this bathtub a little bit more. And then at the 25-year, you can kind of see that water spill out a little bit further onto these floodplains in the village. And then we can keep moving forward into the 50-year, 100-year, 500-year floods, where you can see a lot of the village kind of underwater, and a lot of these different floodplains really almost at max capacity there. Then we tested a few other little alternatives where we put the 500-year flood on the Lamoille and then the 2-year flood on the tributaries. And this is a really cool way of seeing the impact of like backwatering on the tributaries on the Lamoille. So you can see, even though the Guion is at a 2-year flood, this whole area is still really flooded at the 500-year. And then if we switch it, you can see that when the Guion's at a 500-year flood and the Lamoille's at a 2-year flood, there's not a lot of impact to the village. And that kind of tells us how much of an influence the Lamoille has on the flood patterns in this area, and that it's kind of is mainly dictated by how much water is flowing on the Lamoille. And then we did do a test run of what we think about the July 2023 flood looked like. Anything else to share?
You just wanted velocity?
Velocity. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So again, the dark blue kind of shows where the water is moving a bit slower. And these red areas are where the water is moving a lot faster, kind of in the main channel here.
What size flood is that one?
This one is the estimated July 2023. Well, we can put the 2-year.
Were you able to model any effects of any restrictions of water getting out of Johnson?
You mean, like alternatives, like to make changes?
Yeah, for example, the bridges just outside of town, or
We are gonna get to that after the demo. That's the second part of of our discussion, so yeah,
sorry, I'll be quiet.
no, that's a perfect transition. Let's transition to that, exactly. Great, thanks, Joe. Model demo is done.
It
We
makes me,
managed.
it makes me think, Seth and company, that how impactful is that Holmes Meadow work actually going to be? Because Holmes Meadow was flooded very early and it didn't contain a lot of a lot of water from what it looked like anyway. Just curious if, if that was, can you do modeling like removing the soil from the specific peninsula area to see what the impact would be in this type of modeling that you were just showing? Or is that also the next part?
You all are perfectly on cue, Paul and Beth. Take it away, Doug.
So we're getting to that. We're just gonna run through, before we get to the specific alternatives, just kind of some of the things that we're looking for, as you said, are there constrictions, are there bridges that are holding back water? Like you just pointed out, Beth, Holmes Meadow, there's fill that could be removed, what kind of impact could that have, these floodplain reconnections? And then finally, places where these floods are gonna keep hitting, are so many of our, roads and highways are along the river, what kind of velocities are we seeing, what kind of depths, how can we protect the infrastructure that, we just can't move or get out of the way? And so just wanted to show a couple quick examples of, where we've done this work before, both in the Lamoille watershed and in other parts of Vermont. So this is a quick example of removing a constriction. This is in Jeffersonville. The rail trail was crossing the Brewster River, just upstream of the Lamoille River. As you can see in the before shot, it was, a small old railroad crossing. And in the after shot, it, about doubled in size, providing that space for the, 364 days of the year where the water is flowing through the channel, on the left side. But when there is a flood, now it has this floodplain on the right side of the pillar to be able to spread out and allow water to move out of the village. It's just off screen to the left here. An example of a floodplain restoration, Beth, just as you asked, removing fill from especially historically filled areas by the river. This was in Northfield, Vermont, right along the Dog River, where a number of homes that you can see on the left side experienced really catastrophic flooding during Irene. And a number of these homes went through the buyout program and provided the opportunity to do a floodplain restoration in this location. So that's what you can see on the after. This is now a kind of floodplain park with trails and access to the river. but it's been lowered on average of 4 feet. So, whereas before it would take, a large flood to start getting out, and then all of a sudden it's getting into the homes. Now our smaller routine floods are getting up into this floodplain and spreading out and lowering the water level for those bigger floods. Again, back to Jeffersonville. Part of the analysis that Jessica and Roy did after Irene was, looking at how, the flow would come down the Brewster and would be trying to get under Route 15 into the Lamoille. And then, water would even back up from the Lamoille into the village and it would really kind of get stuck in the village. So they identified this opportunity to put in a new dry culvert, sometimes we call them. So it's a culvert that isn't, transporting a stream under the road. It's only, only function is during flood, to allow, flood waters that are backing up into the village to get out under Route 15, which in those conditions is really damming up the water behind the road embankment. So you can see in the bottom right, it under, in 2019 during the Halloween flood, see how that was working and really acting to drain water from the village back into the Lamoille. So now we're just going to quickly run through. I know everyone wants to get to the results now that we've teased them a little bit. But for each community along the model here, we've talked to the community and partners and LCPC about what are places where you really want us to use the model to look at alternatives. So here in Hardwick, there are a couple of bridges that folks think might be increasing flooding upstream that we're looking at. The Lamoille Valley Rail Trail Bridge is bolded there because we're going to look at some of the results there just in a minute. A couple of areas with prior damage and then potential floodplain reconnections in town that we think might show some benefit. Moving downstream to Wolcott, again a couple of bridges, Lamoille Valley Rail Trail again, and then areas that have kind of experienced repeat damages, and some of the things we're looking at are are there options in these other places to fortify or decrease vulnerability to floods. And then downstream to Morrisville, a couple of locations, the Oxbow Park, and upstream potential agricultural fields that could be floodplain restoration opportunities. Down into Johnson, as we were talking about, looking for those constrictions, right in the village as well as downstream, downstream bridges along Route 15, and then floodplain reconnections opportunities right around the village. Cambridge, the Wrong Way Bridge is one that comes up a lot as potentially causing more issues. So we're looking at alternatives there, as well as a couple of potential floodplain locations. And then all the way down in Fairfax in Georgia, a couple of bridges again that we're looking at different alternatives for a floodplain reconnection. And then there's a number of places that are identified as suffering repeat damages from floods along roads, along wastewater treatment plant, that we're able to look at the flood characteristics, the velocities, the depths to see what kind of protection those critical infrastructure need.
So with that, we are not presenting on every single alternative tonight. So we're giving like an overview of a few, that are in different locations, and at different types of projects to give kind of an idea. And then when we do the community meetings, we're gonna have kind of more, kind of focus on that particular communities. So starting out upstream in Hardwick, the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail Bridge and embankment goes kind of across the floodplain here. There's a lot of locations where the rail trail is kind of parallel to the river, and it kind of acts like a berm. In this case, It goes across the floodplain. You can see it with a little red indicator in the aerial photo, and then also what it looks like in the photo there. So we can see it really well in, I don't know if you'll be able to see the, oh yeah, you can actually see it. So basically the bridge goes across the river here, but then this whole low part of the floodplain has this really tall embankment that acts as like a big berm and blocks all of the flow that otherwise would be moving kind of north across this lower floodplain here. So we've looked at two initial potential solutions here. One is what some people might consider a crazy idea, but the idea of actually lowering a portion of the embankment here down closer to the floodplain elevation. This would mean that there'd be some serious like reconstruction of the trail and reinforcement of the trail so that it would allow overtopping of floodwaters. The floodwater would purposely be allowed to go over the trail instead of partly what happens now is it hits the trail and whatever can't go through the bridge is shunted over and it actually angles it over, and through this whole area where there's been a lot of damage to businesses and the wastewater treatment facility.
And Walgreens.
And Walgreens, so there's been a lot of damage in this area. So that was one idea, and the other idea is a very traditional idea. It makes a lot of sense to just widen the bridge, so you get more water under the bridge. So two potential ideas. We plotted the topography with just a small storm, a 2-year storm here, and you can see that there is really nice floodplain connection. You can see that there is water out on the floodplains upstream and downstream, even for relatively frequent storms, but it's not able to connect through because the trail is so high through here. Here's a photo taken by David Upson, town manager. Pretty neat video that was taken. This was really helpful for us when validating the model and really understanding what was happening in this area. So this is the cross-sectional view in the model. So as though you're standing upstream of the bridge in the river and looking downstream, you've kind of created a cross-section through their slice. With the 100-year flood is this kind of blue line here. And you can see for the 100-year flood, the water is certainly not all going through the bridge. A lot of it's going over, and this is the Route 1415. I guess it's probably, yeah, it would be up in here. So really a lot of water out onto the highway. So the alternative would be to just, the first alternative is to leave the bridge the way it is and slope down. This looks extremely steep, like you fall off a cliff here, but it's because the vertical exaggeration of this cross section. This is actually a 5% slope, which it's what?
1%.
It's a 1% slope?
Yes.
Oh, 1% slope. It's super ADA accessible. We had talked about a 5% slope to
It looks really
maintain.
scary. It looked even scarier.
Okay, well, you could walk down this very easily. So it would lower down this whole section of the embankment, with significant reinforcement, with riprap and paving and things, so it doesn't continuously wash out. The second alternative is to widen the bridge. So, if you kind of flip back up and then back down, you can see the bridge is significantly wider. So those are our two options as an initial cut of looking at what could be done here. So this is looking in profile. So along the length of the river. So the black line at the bottom with the dots is the bottom of the river. These tall pointy things are our bridges. We have our rail trail bridge, which is where we're doing the alternative. And then upstream, you have the Church Street Bridge. And then our water surfaces are shown with these colors. So this kind of deep blue at the top is our existing water surface elevation for our existing model. And that's what we modeled it as for the July 2023 storm. And then this next line down is where we are predicting the water surface would be if we widened out the bridge. And then the green one is if you kept the bridge the same size and ramped down to like cut the embankment out down at the floodplain elevation. So this is a pretty significant result. So 1.7 feet lower water surface for a big flood like this, extending pretty far upstream is a big deal. And you know, we don't always find alternatives like this that could have a big impact, especially around all the businesses. When we look in cross section, we have two buildings specifically called out in this cross section here. We have the Tops grocery store as well as a bank, and really showing a pretty significant reduction in water surface predicted at this location. Looking in map view, you know, there's still a floodplain. There's still like a lot of water and a lot of locations where we would expect the water to go. But having it be lower, you know, even up to almost 2 feet lower, we think is going to make a really big difference on the state highway. This is Route 14 and Route 15, kind of combined through here. You know, if you look at the existing model, the water's out on the highway for quite a long stretch, versus kind of pulled back from the highway. We're gonna look a little closer at exactly what's happening kind of up in this intersection and how it's looking at the wastewater treatment plant, but we just were pretty excited to show these initial results here. And
A lot of the people who've worked and had buildings in that area for a long time have said that was when it changed, when they improved the rail travel.
we and I have two that we can kind of flip between up for a second. So these are the same images, but it's a little easier to see the change in the edges. We had a great discussion with the taco shop owner.
Oh,
I don't know what his name was, but it's one of the businesses in this building here, and
Mhm.
he was agreeing with what you just said, that you know, the rail trail bridge seems like the water can't all get through and it gets pushed over, you know, and into these buildings. So this certainly seems like one to continue to refine and look at, and maybe, you know, do a combination with one of the other alternative locations is to look at some more reconnection on this this floodplain here, which is town owned. So
Lower and.
yeah, so you know, one of the things that we were talking about is like, you know, this is a spot where it makes sense to look at doing both, like put both in the model at the same time and see what those additive benefits are. And you know, I think Beth, and Paul, to answer your question, like that is what the model can do. So we can specifically like identify a spot where we think we might be able to do a project and then alter the model to like show that alternative and then look at the results.
You see what the alternative does to the Cooper Brook area? Like, can you,
Yeah, you
in the
know,
future?
yeah, we can. And I think that is where maybe combining with the floodplain that's here might be good, because Cooper Brook is kind of like right here. It's very close. So
Mhm.
that's where, you know, maybe combine with the floodplain here, maybe those benefits can even extend further upstream. So,
Yeah.
but you know, we felt like this was a good example of, you know, how maybe a constriction like a bridge or a culvert could be changed to have some results. So I am going to jump to an additional example, different example. So this is moving downstream to Johnson, there is a large 12-acre parcel on Westcombe Road in this area where there's been a history of flooding. There's multiple previous buyouts in this area. The skate park is in this location, if it helps you with the landmark. And then there's 2 current buyouts kind of happening adjacent or, just very close by. So we looked at, one potential alternative here. So this is looking at the existing topography. You can see there's like a low floodplain, much lower floodplain right here. And then, the existing neighborhood here. And then this is the area where, there's been some buyouts. So it provides like a nice opportunity. You can see that this whole area here, or a lot of the area, does flood in the existing 100-year flood, but there are certainly high points that act like berms along here, which inhibit flow. And not only kind of the empty parcel gets flooded, but also the adjacent neighborhood as well. So we just did one iteration just to see like what it might look like. So this whole kind of brownish area would be lowered down. Oh, so dug down multiple feet, to let the river out and in this area to get kind of out of the village, which is just upstream and kind of around the corner where there's a pretty big constriction kind of in this area. And this is interesting, like across the river, there's a big industrial fill area from the that's been capped, and that's like a contamination zone. So we couldn't do floodplain restoration across the river. So this is kind of a nice location where it could happen. So in cross-section view, the idea is like the black wiggly line is the existing ground elevation in cross-section looking down the river. With what we don't like to see is the high point of the land next to the edge of the river. That's like a berm. It means that as the water is coming up, it's not able to kind of get out. So with the high berm here, there'd be quite a cut proposed. And this has some pretty interesting results. So the location of the project is down in this area. And then you can see on here, this again is in profile, just to be clear. We have Railroad Street, which is kind of on the upstream end of the village. The Guion comes in this area. So, pretty exciting result of, even up to 1 foot of water surface reduction. This is for the 100-year flood. And then just to show specifically, this is at the confluent. It extends up into the confluence and up into the Guion. So here you can see the Route 15 Main Street Bridge and Pearl Street. So extending up to kind of that Pearl Street area where there's a falls with some reductions. So this seemed like some promising results to be able to discuss with the community there.
So just to clarify what you're saying, I just want to make sure I understand all of what you just said. So you're basically saying that one project of removing the heightened terrain and lowering the floodplain in on Westcombe Road, including some of the buyout property locations, would have a upstream impact, including upstream into the Guion, because it would allow Guion water to flow?
That's what the model is looking like. And I mean, we're gonna do some checking and some iterations. But yeah, this was the first iteration we did here, and we're excited to kind of dive in and see, maybe there's certain parts of this that are even more impactful. So, you know, we're working through that right now to just to discuss with Johnson next week, actually, to really kind of break this down. Do you need to do the whole footprint? Is there maybe one particular location that's the real crux of it?
Right, and
This
then
is
that combined with that little peninsula right above on the top, that's home, the top peninsula is Holmes Meadow. That they're already
right.
talking about reducing fill, so the combination of those two would be really interesting.
Yeah, very exciting. So, and the Holmes Meadow project is right here and it is currently out to bid. So it's not only being talked about, it's close to happening, which is super exciting to kind of link these together.
Hey,
Yeah, and
Jessica.
this is a big project. Roy, go ahead.
I just wanted to maybe add on what Beth is talking about. In a lot of our flood mitigation work around the state region, we often identify these critical locations that are holding water back in a large flood, and because of either the river somehow got disconnected from the floodplain or there was filling. And our initial model results suggest this is one of those spots that when you take down flood, like the land locally, the effects extend way upstream. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think it's like over a mile. And if you look at the terrain here, you see a sort of high ridge that sort of the Lamoille comes through. And then this floodplain sits right in front of that. And it just gives it enough storage to release some of that water. And we've identified a few of these in our flood mitigation work. So Jessica mentioned the word backwatering, where a river floods, it pushes water back. You often see this at undersized bridges, but you can also see it on just a floodplain. This is one of those spots. So to add that.
And I think the one other thing I would add is, if we go back to the aerial photo, like this area does include a road, which does lead to a piece of the community here. So there are a lot of logistics and that would need to go into this. Like how does this neighborhood and the water treatment plant get access during a high flood? If we are basically removing this road from usage during a flood, and how does this road get reconstructed at a lower elevation? So I don't mean to say this is like an easy project, but it's one that might make a big difference. And if you okay, so then here is our existing and proposed floodplain. Similar to the one that we were looking at before, it's not completely eliminating flooding, but the flooding is kind of pulled in and at a lower predicted elevation. And you can kind of see, if we go back and forth, like the floodplain kind of contracting. Okay, and if you bear with us, we have one more example, then we can have kind of a more in-depth discussion with folks. So this is in Fairfax, kind of moving further downstream, a little bit different type of project. Doug introduced the idea that maybe there's some locations that it makes sense to continue protecting, and how the model can help inform those areas is basically what this example is. This is a location along Fletcher Road here where there's a lot of erosion with the road shoulder slumping into the river. And the model really can be used to evaluate velocities. So this is an example of really looking at the modeled velocities at a particular location to understand where those vulnerability might be, or to help in design. So just to reiterate, the higher velocities where you might see more erosion are shown in the red, and the slower moving water is the blue. we have a kind of summary of what those velocities are at this location, by storm. And, these are some very large velocities. I mean, you could see boulders moving down a stream by the time you get to 10, even 7 feet per second. And, you're seeing those really high erosive velocities, even at the 10-year flood size. So, kind of having this velocity information could not only help, kind of screen for these areas that are more vulnerable, but also to design, the type of stabilization that might go into a particular location by understanding those velocities. So I know that was a lot, and it was an hour of like a lot of different information. I would imagine folks are pretty excited about all the other alternatives. We have 3 tonight and more in future meetings. But I mean, we can take questions or have discussion if folks have any. Or Roy, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else. I know we've been talking a lot up here.
No, thanks. Listening, it's great.
I have a question. It might be a dumb question, but is is it ever a thing that could it be harmful to do like too much lowering in too many areas? Is that something to think about at all, or not really?
I think it's a really good, this is actually an area where Roy's been participating in a lot of research specifically. And so maybe he wants to weigh in, but I guess I would say in a particular location, like if we choose a spot and we go too low, it might wind up inviting the river in and causing erosion and causing the river to move around quite a bit. So we do tend to pick an elevation where we're expecting the normal flow to stay within the bankful channel and kind of the floodplain flows to come out onto it. So we do take it into consideration in a project design.
Yeah. Maybe I'll add, the one thing I'll add is, right now there's a general view that we need to restore flood storage. And the reason is we've kind of spent a century or two filling mostly along floodplains. And so as communities are asking, how can we protect upstream areas? And people want to protect their communities quickly, we have to say like it's a long-term process. Like it's not only Westcombe Road that's gonna change the flood patterns. It's actually a combination of a lot of different floodplains that either the river lost connection to or were filled as part of that. So I think Jessica's answer is spot on. There's an art to the design of the floodplain, so the river doesn't go to a place where we have infrastructure and people living around that. But at the same time, we have to do this in a distributed way to get enough flood capacity to really make a meaningful difference for our communities. And so that's kind of a work in progress that's taking place. And there is some active research being led out of the University of Vermont to try to answer a very simple question, but actually it's a really complicated question: is how much storage is enough in the upstream watershed? So yeah, stay tuned. But right now, these sort of individual projects are really essential to keep moving along to start protecting the communities.
I had a similar question around the storage because it seems that if you let too much water sit or flow too slowly, then you cause opposite problems, I would think. So even if you're not in a village area and you're using agricultural land and you're slowing it too much, then in theory you can be building water in those spots. But anyway, that wasn't my question. My question is that I was just looking at a map while we were talking for the past few minutes. And rail trail really rides along Lamoille for a good chunk of, well, through a good chunk of Johnson anyway, and a good chunk of Hyde Park. And I think actually, like we talked about, saw in Hardwick upstream too. And I would assume that that really restricts the ability to expand floodplain areas. And this might not be the right group, but is there any talk with VTrans around what this means and how the rail trail could be diverted? Possibly to be more entertaining for the people riding it, so that they're not always on a river, but also so that it does help with the problems we're having with water flow.
I have been discussing this a little bit with the rail trail program in V-Trans, and they're gonna weigh in on the long-term recovery and resiliency plan. They also have I don't know if they're called river scientists or just, they have people studying the hydrology and hydraulics of the river, just like on their state team, but they're interested in participating in SLR's work too, and some of the alternatives that might come out of this project, so they're open to discussing it.
That's good. It feels like that could be a real conflict since there's such a big rail trail push. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Tori.
But there's a lot of co-benefits that could come out of working with the rail trail and protecting it and our communities, so.
I have a question. At what point will we be able to play with you and play with the model? So we can, look at what's the combined effect of Wescombe Road and Holmes Meadow and maybe the Route 15 bridge by Hogback and, add these things all together and see, okay, what difference does this make? And then, okay, let's take one away and play with the cost benefit kind of analysis. Is that something you guys do? Is that something we initiate? How does that work?
Well, it sounds like you're talking about Johnson specifically.
Sorry,
Is
yes,
what
I
it
am.
sounds like. And I think the answer is we're gonna do a lot of that next Thursday night, actually. Kind of talking through like how different alternatives might look on their own and at least some combinations of how they interact. So I think that's really the, a big opportunity for that. And then, if there's other ideas that come out of next Thursday, we can try to get them into the recording as well. But I think one thing that's really neat about the model is that it's not, it exists now. So as new ideas come up or, projects come up, we can continue to use it to evaluate.
So is
Yeah.
that something you'd be looking for input from the towns? For
Yeah.
those ideas to assess or?
Yeah. Do you know about next Thursday's meeting by any chance?
I'd have to look at my calendar. I can't remember one date of the next, to be honest.
I had been discussing with Jesse, who's the new chair of the Johnson Planning Commission, about hosting a discussion about this at the planning commission meeting next Thursday.
Oh, at the planning commission meeting. Yes, I do know that. Okay, yeah.
Not the same thing as the town. When you say the town, none of us think the Johnson Planning Commission.
Yeah, I thought
We
you were
all
talking
think
about
the select board.
a more global meeting. Another question I guess I have, or just a thought, when you're doing the modeling is Route 15 has some sort of vulnerable spots, both east and west of Johnson, where the river comes very close to the road. And, Johnson could easily lose access or easy access to Marshville and the hospital, for example, in flooding. And I'm just thinking that might be important for modeling more about velocity probably in those places than inundation like we think of in Johnson Village, but of concern nonetheless.
The problem with Wolcott, we lose it both going to Morrisville and going to Hardwick. We're like an island.
Not really a question, just like a comment, but um, when we were doing the site visits in Johnson, it was a really good conversation we had about like rocks being put in to break up ice in certain areas and looking at things from more of when there's ice jams and when that winter flooding happens. Is there any kind of uh, modeling or solutions that can be put in there to show solutions for those kind of instances?
I think that's a good question. I think one of the things that the model can help with is kind of identifying places where the river either speeds up or slows down and there where constrictions are, where the ice might start to jam out. And then test alternatives like removing those constrictions or adding floodplains where ice might be able to shed off.
Mhm.
But to Adrian's question, can you add constrictions on the fly just to see what happens? Like if a flood got blocked by, yeah, cool.
We can, yeah.
And then just a wild idea I wanted to throw out there. But I wonder if we could like think about out of box solutions that haven't been done in other places. Um, one idea when we were talking that came to mind is I don't know if this has ever been done, but kind of uh, like when beavers build dams, I don't know if we could make like our own kind of dam with metal or something, or I don't know, kind of a solution that would slow down the river, but um, yeah, just thinking of things that haven't been done before and what those would look like.
That was a conversation starter. Nice job, Adrian.
When you bring up beavers, it just stops.
I don't mean to like not respond. One of the things that we've seen done in a few spots and we worked on I don't know, where we're gonna talk about um, the berry debris catchers, maybe. I saw you unmute.
Yeah, sure. I guess in thinking about, small dams tend to elevate floodwaters locally. Um, Now, so they're certainly they're not a solution on a main stem river, but they out in the watershed, the periphery of the watershed, they do create flood storage. And that is when Doug was talking about hydrology, that is a factor. The more storage in the watershed, the lower the peak flows. So beavers do play important flood storage roles in the periphery, and we have in fact built, beaver dam analogs. They're called these like, human-made mini beaver dams that seed the beaver population in areas that can flood away from the lands that people are using to create flood storage. Um, in the wave of big flooding we see, a lot of these beaver dams break. They usually don't have tons of storage, so they get absorbed in that. But what Jessica was alluding to, which is a little out of the box in our country, they do it a little more in Europe. They do debris catchers in areas. They're these concrete or metal sort of pillars that are put in areas where you receive a lot of runoff and a lot of large wood coming into areas where you have bridges, and they require some maintenance, even some cleaning out in the middle of a very large flood, which is a challenge for safety for people. Um, but they are a little out of the box, and people have used those to mitigate ice jam flooding. There are some examples actually in the Lamoille where there's these obelisks in the river that break up ice jam to flood in a certain location. And then more and more people are reconnecting floodplains and removing small dams to keep velocity moving and to allow the ice to shed out onto the floodplains. Like if the Westcombe Road project were to get built, or like at Holmes Meadow, those are areas where ice can get out of the river and then there's less ice to jam up in downstream bridges, for example. So, yeah, it's an interesting thought to think outside the box. We certainly can keep pondering ideas, and the model is a great tool to kind of do that.
To your point about thinking outside the box, Adrian, in this, actually, when this first started, there were a couple of things that came up, and one was around, could we raise buildings in the village so that they were raised buildings? And another thing that came up was around having structures on barges so that the barges rose with the water. All things that would be interesting to see in a model if we have properties that were not buyout properties, but were in those 100-year flood ranges. Could those be options for figuring something like that out? Anyway, just a comment more than a question. I do have one other question, and my other question, I'm going to go away from this topic for a second. When we first started talking about the LiDAR mapping and the updated FEMA data, that's all really cool stuff. My concern, most of my comments usually revolve around my PTSD from 2023. So just full transparency. That's where I kind of live when it comes to these topics. But when you talked about the LiDAR data, you talked about it being 2022 data. And when you talked about FEMA data, I know FEMA's been collecting data for, 30 years, 50 years, whatever. Our data is like from the 80s before refreshed data that's still in a draft, it sounds like. So my question is, if we know that a lot of the data that's being used is collected since 2022, and the big flood of 2023 occurred, which was Johnson's second largest on record, and then our fourth largest on record occurred in 2024. How confident are we in the data that we have, given that such big flooding has happened since? And I believe, and I think we all see, that the rivers have changed pretty significantly since the major flooding. What does that mean to these models?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Beth. I think that that's a big reason why we took the time to like do the validation step and like the checking. Like we know it's like an astronomically expensive endeavor to like survey the bottom of every channel, even if we just do it at the cross-section location. So, we've used the best available data in each spot. And in some cases it's survey, in some cases it's field measurements, in some cases it's field FEMA data. But that's just in most spots, like the bottom of the channel, where maybe bars have formed or not. Most of the floodplains haven't changed that much. There are some spots they have, and we've tried to get surveyor update them where we can. But the validation piece, we're able to compare those high water marks that we saw to what the model's saying and say, okay, are we getting something that's close enough that we feel like we can test alternatives? Like, we might not be able to say the exact elevation of water inside a particular building for a particular flood size, but what we can do is we can say, okay, in this area, if we make this bridge bigger, we're gonna see in the order of a foot difference upstream. So I think that like, we always need to keep in mind that it's not perfect, but it's doing a really pretty good job. And we did have a lot of data. I mean, those storms actually gave us quite a bit of data to do checking. We don't always have that much high watermark data to be able to go back and compare. So it feels like it's functioning really quite well based on videos and high watermarks. But you're right, it's not exact. And there's always different storms. I mean, kind of back to what Deb was saying, like, every storm we get is gonna be different. And like what we call it, if we call it the 100-year, we call it just a big flood. It's always gonna be different in different spots and in different parts of the watershed. And maybe it's the tributaries that get more flooding in a particular storm versus the main stem. And so I think we're trying to have a tool that works for evaluating alternatives and being able to like talk to folks about where we expect water to be and
Yeah,
what that water
don't get me
might
wrong,
do.
I love it. Like I'm all for it. I love what you've done. It's really good. And thanks for that reminder about the plain versus the footprint of the rivers themselves. That's an important point to remember. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Jessica, one thing I might add is like when we started building this one of a kind large scale model in the state in the Lamoille, we kind of treated it as a shell because, as Jessica said, we couldn't afford to survey every cross section over so many tens of miles of river. But then we go in and we do an alternative in Cambridge and we survey all around there locally and we put that in the model to make sure that that area is very detailed. So I think it's important to remember, like when we're doing Westcombe Road or the Wrong Way Bridge, we're getting survey data like now to overlay and insert it into the model. So maybe the peripheries of the model are less accurate, but then you come into these areas that are like that have very current data. So that is kind of the beauty of having this large scale model is that the model will get better as more and more people use it and do local projects to a bridge or a floodplain or whatever. And then if the data keep going back in the model, it's gonna keep improving over time in a really cost effective way.
And, you know, maybe next week it's gonna get better because one of the washout spots in Hardwick is getting surveyed this week, and then they're gonna give us the data next week, and then we're gonna put it in. Like, it's a very real-time situation, because we're actively working on it, we're gonna like put that in right away, when that happens, so.
I heard get our rulers out and send text to Tori and Seth often. Done.
So we're pretty excited about the community meetings coming up over the next month, you know, having some more in-depth conversations.
Next
So you have
Thursday,
the planning commission one's next Thursday, and what was the other one?
in the Lamoille region, the 17th Monday evening is with the Cambridge Planning Commission. And then Monday, December 8th will be with Wolcott Planning Commission.
Oh, okay.
And then we have, Hardwick is gonna have a series of meetings, on December 3rd and 4th. And, we're still working with, Northwest Regional Planning Commission on like their meetings. They're not on the calendar yet, but they're happening in the next month too.
And Johnson folks, should we go to greater lengths to ensure the select board and trustees are invited to the next Thursday's meeting? So that
Yeah, that would be great if you could.
okay.
Thank you.
I'm not on
There's
either,
a
but a firm yes for me too, because I want to go. I'm not on any board.
there's a community meal happening that night too at the college, so I'll try to direct people to go to this afterwards if they're able to.
That starts at 5, correct, Adrian?
Yeah. hmm
Yeah, okay.
But I appreciate all the hard work you guys have put in, and I'm excited to see more. I really love this, and it's exciting.
When you come to the individual towns, will you be just focusing on that town?
Yeah, Linda, you know, I think we're gonna try to maybe even pare down the beginning part so we have more time on the alternatives. So like when we come to Wolcott, we're gonna have it very focused on Wolcott. And we'll probably not talk about Westcombe Road or the rail trail in Hardwick at all. Like that wouldn't be part of it.
Well, this is great. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.